ready because I was still primarily focused on translating. So now I'm still doing that, but I've finished the majority of my books. So we'll get started. So at the start of the talk, I always like to have like a little bit of a nice quote that oh, sorry, it just got to pop up that it's recording. To kind of like talk a little bit about give us a little bit of a quote about acupuncture, and so this is a famous quote from a book called the Zhenju Wendui by Wang Ji in about 1530. And so it says, if one is ignorant of the channel vessels, it's not possible they know where the blood and qi comes and goes. If one is ignorant of the acupuncture points, it is not possible they know the location of the evil qi. For those that know and use them, the use will be effective and the disease will begin to settle. So I always like to kind of open up with a nice quote from an acupuncture book that kind of, sets the stage about what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, which is essentially channels and points. So before we start getting into the content, I just thought also I'd give you guys a little bit of an introduction. It's already been done a little bit, but I'll just offer a little bit more. So yeah, I started practicing acupuncture in 2009. And as I graduated, one of my teachers said, why don't you go study Chinese language? So I went to enroll straight after and study Chinese language. And that was like another kind of 3 years initially. And then I finished up like honors in about 2015. And then from there, I went to study herbalism as well. And I went to China on 2 separate years to do just a small internship with Professor Huang as well. And that was quite amazing as well. So I'm still in practice right now in Brisbane as well. And then I work in 2 clinics practicing acupuncture and herbs as well. Now, my work with Purple Cloud Press is essentially, this is my current works, what I've done as well. These 2 explanations of channels and points. This is the complete compendium of Zhangjing Yue. And this one is actually just a recent book that has just come out maybe in the last, I want to say 2 months or 3 months as well, by a guy called Will Servals, An Archaeology of the Qiao Vessels as well. This one is not a pure translation. It's more kind of like looking at the Qiao vessels, looking at how they were discussed, looking at how they were treated, and a very in-depth discussion as well. To me, this is probably the highest level of scholarship being applied to Chinese medicine right now as well. So if you guys haven't got any of those books, I recommend checking them out and seeing if they're kind of your thing. In 2019 as well, I founded a school of rectification and clarification with my good friend Ivan Zavala. And this essentially is the approach that we take to Chinese medicine as well, where we want to go back to the source of things as well. Because when we learn Chinese medicine in the West, we're often deprived of our source. People will say, oh, an acupuncture point does this, an acupuncture point does that. A formula treats this, a formula treats that, but we don't know where that idea came from, nor do we know what context it was being used or discussed in. So the basic principle of the School of Rectification and Clarification is that we try and analyze source materials and find out where these ideas came from so we know how this worked. And that leads me on to the next part, which I founded, and this will be probably being developed later this year, is the Academy of Source-Based Medicine with Alan Saw and Will Servals, Will Servals being the author of this book. And we will hopefully be putting up lectures throughout the next year as well on a variety of different topics, from classical formula to history to even going back to foundations of Chinese medicine as well. So this is the complete compendium. I just thought, the cover is really cool. I love the cover. It was actually done by an Australian author as well. So, sorry, an Australian artist, and I love it. Also, we're nearly finished up the next book in the complete compendium of Zhangjing Yue, which is his formulas as well. So hopefully we'll have another book out in the next probably 2 to 3 months. We're very close to finishing the editing, so I'm really excited to be talking about that. Being once again translated by Alan and edited by myself. And then this is the 2 volumes of my books, Explanations of Channels and Points as well. And we'll be talking a little bit about the importance of this book in the lecture later today. Okay. So today's lecture, I thought that we would talk a little bit about the introduction to the history of acupuncture and the literary schools as I see it as well. And then we'll talk about the importance of the text Explanations of Channels and Points by Yue Hanjian, which is the one that I translated. And then we'll talk a little bit about maybe the optimal way to study acupuncture, the past versus the present, function versus indication as well, because that is very much how I would say is representative of this past versus present study of acupuncture as well. Okay. And finally, the last section will be my approach on how I will teach you guys to study and analyze an acupuncture point and show you what you will be getting when you sign up to this course as well. Because I really think that you'll be, if you take this course, you'll get information about acupuncture and points that you guys will not get anywhere else. Okay. So, history of acupuncture. Now, just let me say this, that you could do a 14-week course on the history of acupuncture, okay? I'm going to talk to you guys about it for maybe 15 minutes. So there will absolutely be things that I miss, but I hope to just give you guys a little bit of an overview, which will lead into the next topic of explanations and channels and points and why that book is important, okay? So, history of acupuncture. What we'll start off with is we have classical texts or the canonical texts. You can call them either way, you know. And so what are these? First off, we have Yellow Emperors in a classic, the Su Wen and Lingshu, or known also as the Huangde Neijing. Okay, so sometimes you might see people translate this as internal medicine or Yellow Emperor's internal medicine, or anything to do with internal medicine is just flat out wrong, because you also have another text called the Huangde Waijing, okay? Wai meaning outer. So it's actually, when inner and outer are used in this context, it means basically volume 1 and volume 2, because if you guys have read the Neijing, you will know that not only does it talk about external problems, it talks about, well, sorry, not only does it talk about internal problems, it talks about external problems as well. So that translation doesn't make sense, okay? Now, this text, or these texts, I should say, are very important for the study of acupuncture. Particularly in the Lingshu, we see Lingshu chapter 10, Jingmai, or basically the channels and network vessels, okay? And that's where the channels come from, the modern channel system comes from, okay? And that's going to be, we'll talk a little bit about that as well, but that's a very important chapter in terms of studying from the Neijing. And I really recommend, if you guys haven't read Lingshu, and if you're going to read one chapter, read chapter 10, and I would recommend Paul Anschold's translation as well. Okay, so the next important text is the Nanjing. Now, this is often translated as the classic of difficulties. I think that is also an incorrect translation, okay? Though this is a little bit more debatable. Why is it an incorrect translation? Well, it should be translated as difficulties of the classics, because there are multiple classics that it talks about. It isn't specific to the Huangde Neijing. So it is obviously trying to give us explanations based on multiple other medical texts. So it shouldn't be classic of difficulties, because to me, that gives it this kind of false idea that it's only talking about one text, which two historical commentators, a guy called Xu Lingtai or Xu Dachun, and another one called Liao Ping, they were very critical of the Nanjing, because they said, oh, it's talking about an idea that isn't included in the Neijing? Well, that's because it's the difficulties of the classics, not, the difficulty of the classic. It is talking about multiple texts, because we know that there were multiple medical classics that have unfortunately ultimately all been lost. Besides, the Huangde Neijing is the only one that is still extant. Now, the difficulties of the classics or the Nanjing, that gives us a lot of very important theoretical information for acupuncture as well. We see a lot of the ideas of, like, tonifying, draining, mother and child points. Also, we see a very important disease schematic called the 5 evils, which I'm going to be talking about later, because that is extremely important to the disease classification system of the explanations of channels and points. Now, the final text of what I would say is the classical text of acupuncture is the systematic classic of acupuncture and moxibustion, the Jiayi Jing, also called the AB classic of acupuncture and moxibustion as well. This text is extremely important, and I think unfortunately hasn't really been highlighted in the West, and kind of is a little bit slipped away in China. Pre-1911, you would find, I think, a lot of it much more in China as well. They would often quote it, okay? Because the systematic classic of acupuncture and moxibustion is actually made up of 3 texts, okay? It's made up of the Su Wen, the Lingshu, which form the Huangde Neijing, but it's actually made up of another text called the Mingtang Jing, or the Bright Hawk Classic. Okay, and this Bright Hawk Classic is a text that basically lists individual acupuncture points, and it also then lists indications as well. And it's really only included in the systematic classic of acupuncture and moxibustion. We don't actually have the text surviving on its own. It's only through studying this text that we can see it, and also it gets quoted in later texts, which I'll show you. But it's a very important text for the study of acupuncture points. Now, what we see post-Han Dynasty, and this is up until about kind of Song Dynasty, we have Sun Simiao. Okay, Sun Simiao, he has some point combinations. He quotes the Mingtang Jing as well, same as in this other text called the Wai Tai Mi Yao, which is translated as something like the Arcane Essentials of the Imperial Library. I'm not exactly sure of the perfect translation of that as well, but that's also a text that also quotes the Mingtang Jing as well, or the Bright Hawk Classic. Now, the final person who in post-Han Dynasty, prior to the Song Dynasty, is a guy called Yang Shanshan. Okay, and now he's very important because in China, they actually lost his commentary on the Neijing, which is called the Taisu, okay? And it was discovered in Japan, I think in a Buddhist shrine in about 1830. And, this was one of the earliest commentaries of the Neijing that we have. And they kind of, it flooded scholarly circles and everything like that. And so it's really amazing to have it back. But everyone really focuses on his Taisu, the commentary of the Neijing. What a lot of people don't actually realize or know, that in the shrine, along with the commentary of the Taisu, was one scroll, a commentary on the Mingtang Jing on the lung channel. So he thought that the Mingtang Jing, which is discussing the points and the diseases of the acupuncture points, was important enough to write a commentary as well. So let me just give you guys a little bit of a summary. We have the systematic classic, which is a combination of the Su Wen, the Lingshu, and the Mingtang Jing, and that was compiled by Huangfu Mi in about 280 CE. And he didn't write any commentaries, but this is the earliest basically idea of someone bringing together what should be considered the important study for an acupuncturist as well. And this is really important because I think there might be people who might say, oh, I can just study the Neijing. Well, no, you can't, because Huangfu Mi is the earliest, and he thought it important enough to include, the Mingtang Jing. So we really should be looking at that text as well. And then we have Yang Shangshan, and he also wrote a commentary on it as well. So these are all very early authors telling us about the importance of kind of these three texts and also the Mingtang Jing. Now, after this, we kind of go from about maybe like 1000, 1200 AD, we get some more writings about acupuncture popping up. And I summarized it up into kind of 4 schools, okay? And now you're not going to find these schools anywhere in a book because these are my own ideas. These are my own kind of creations based upon what I've read and almost like the literary trends that I see that they write in the books as well, because you kind of see and they tend to quote each other or they tend to kind of, you know, focus on different things. So this is my understanding of basically the literary tradition of acupuncture. So we begin with points, with the point school, okay? And in my opinion, the most famous point school book is the Jianzhu Zizhen Jing, or the Acupuncture and Moxibustion Classic of Supporting Life. Okay, now, what does it mean to have a points school or to be part of the point school? Well, in my opinion, it means that you basically, the points are the main focus of the work. You would discuss the location of the points and most importantly, the indications, so what they treat, okay? If you include those 2 things, then I put that text into the point school. The other thing also is that they will maybe have some songs or odes as well that they might have written or included as well. So essentially the focus of these books is to talk about acupuncture points. They're not so worried about the channel, okay? Which brings me to my next school, which is what I will call the channel commentary school. Okay. Now, the channel commentary school, if you guys remember, I spoke about Lingshu chapter 10, Jingmai, channel vessels, okay? Now, this chapter was so important that a guy called Hua Shou in, I think about 14th century, decided to write an entire book dedicated to understanding that chapter. And he wrote about it, and it was basically, it's called the elucidation of the 14 channels, or the Shi Jing Fa Hui, okay? And it basically tells us, you know, he elaborates and gives us a better understanding of his vision of how the channels flow and move through it. And basically, this book then spawned a whole bunch of other texts that would follow in that style of kind of quoting Lingshu 10 and offering commentaries and understandings of it. But what they didn't include were generally indications for the points. They might include and say this point was located here and so forth, but they don't include indications for it. So they are really only focused about understanding the flow of the channel and where the point is located. So next we come up with the channels and points school, okay? Now, this is where they generally combine the channels and points together, and they'll often offer discussions of the point. They'll just list the indications of the points after they've written about the channel flow as well. And we see this in some important books as well. So it says Zhang Jingyue wrote the Leijing Tui as well. We see it in the Great Compendium of Acupuncture and Moxibustion by which is called the Zhenzhe Dachang in 1601, which is seen as a very important acupuncture text as well. And so these kinds of books, they incorporate basically they don't really have a commentary of Lingshu 10, but they'll include it, and then they'll often include the indications of the points as well. So, you know, the commentary on Lingshu 10 can kind of go either way. It's not their focus. They kind of have a combined approach. Now, the final part that I will talk about is the points commentary school, okay? And here by itself, we have explanations of channels and points, okay? This is the only text that I've seen basically pre-1911 that commentates on the acupuncture points and channels together. In fact, it's really the only acupuncture text besides what was lost by Yang Shangshan in about 7th century that commentates on acupuncture points. You know, so this is kind of incredible because we have this almost same idea being done again, but 1,000 years later. That's just kind of incredible to me to think, because that text was lost, but someone else came up with the same idea to do that. And the thing is, that text was also the explanations of channels and points. That text was also nearly lost as well. Like it was only kind of pieced together by two kind of scribal fragments as well. So once again, we're very lucky to have that text. Okay. And I'm yet to see any other text that I could fit into the points commentary school as well. I'm happy to be proven wrong always. So if anyone has any other kind of text like that, then please tell me about it. The caveat is that it's kind of before 1911, because after 1911, which is what I'm going to show you, we see a lot of acupuncturists talking about channels, points, writing textbooks, particularly people like Cheng Danan. Cheng Danan was a really famous acupuncturist. He wrote a lot about points, about techniques, things like that. He kind of established a lot of important textbooks in the early kind of like Republic era as well. He would also, from what I can tell, one of the first acupuncturists that linked Western diseases together with their Chinese counterpart as well, which is also, I think, a really cool thing to do. You have Lu Shouyan as well. He wrote a lot of textbooks for acupuncturists as well. Very famous. Wang Leiting. He was very famous because he would look for like these kind of like acupuncture. You would create acupuncture formulas that would serve as like a herbal counterpart. So, like he has a famous acupuncture formula that I think works for something like Shi Chuan W Yuan Teng, something like that 10 formula tonification as well. He wrote a lot about Dui Shui, which is kind of point pairings as well. I don't say point combinations because point combinations may be more than 3 points, but point pairings is just 2 points. And he wrote quite a lot about that in his works. Now, modern acupuncturists, we have lots of them. He Pu Ren, Yang Jia San, Deng Kuai Shan, Shi Shui Min, Li Shi Zhen, and many others like Zhang Gu, Wang Jui, etc., etc. They each bring their own important contributions to the medicine as well. For example, Yang Jia San, he approaches the acupuncture points. Yang Jia San and Deng Kuai Shan, from what I can tell, were two of the early pioneers of allocating functions to all the acupuncture points. Deng Kuai Shan, I think, came in at about maybe 1978 to 1982, something around that period. While Yang Jia San, he wrote a textbook like the Di Wu Ban, which are green textbooks. And in that one, for the acupuncture points, all the points have functions as well. So we kind of see acupuncture functions as really only coming in maybe the last 40 years, maybe 50 years, if you want to be generous as well. And like all these guys really contributed a lot to the medicine as well. And what's really interesting is that we see that like in the last kind of 100 years, acupuncture writings have really, really flourished. When we think about Chinese medicine and the textual history, probably anywhere between 98 to 99% of literature is about herbal medicine. Okay, whether it's just standardized internal medicine or specialty herbal medicine like gynecology or pediatrics, or external medicine like Waike, or kind of like bone problems or injuries like Shanke. All of that is generally herbal medicine. And in China, if you talk about Chinese medicine, they think of herbal medicine. If you talk about Chinese medicine in the West, though, generally people think of acupuncture as well. So I think that this is a great thing, though, that we're actually experiencing this amazing, kind of literary growth in writings about acupuncture as well. And I think that's really, really, really cool to see that kind of like acupuncture now is kind of like catching up to kind of where herbal medicine is. That's really, really good, and I'm really happy to see. So that's just a brief introduction to the history of acupuncture. Like I said, we could go into a lecture on each of those texts, some of them by themselves, or at least kind of like each dynasty. But this is just a little bit of an introduction to give you guys an idea also about why I found explanations of channels and points to be such a unique text that I had to basically give it its own category in that it's just so unique. Okay, we'll talk about this text now. All right. So explanations of channels and points, written by a guy called Yue Hanjian. Okay, he lived from around 1602 to 1692, possibly 1682. We're not exactly sure. His name Hanjian means, or Yue Hanjian means literally Yue holding something precious in his mouth. Okay, so obviously, he had something very precious to tell us as well, which obviously, judging by his writings, he did. His courtesy name was Yu Ye, or kind of literally the Jade. And he also had one more name, self-styled name, which is Silianci, which is literally kind of the master longing for the lotus. There was recently a thread on Facebook on scholars of Chinese medicine where people were trying to, understand all the names of doctors have. So you can see this one guy has 3 different names. And that is very, very common in Chinese medicine that people have 3 names, sometimes 4. It's you got to be kind of aware of that, because sometimes you'll be reading someone and you think, oh, wow, this guy's really interesting. I've never heard of him. You look up at his name, it's like, oh, it's that guy, who's already probably amazing, but it's just the same person, That's that's happened to me a few times. So this book, Explanations of Channels of Points, I'm going to talk about it and just give you guys an introduction to what makes it so important. Okay, so essentially it includes commentaries on all the channel and sinew pathways. Okay, so those, Lingshu 10 has already been commented on, as we saw from that guy, Hua Shou, who wrote Elucidation of the 14 Channels. Okay, so Yue Hanjian also includes his own commentaries on the channel pathways as well. However, what has never been done, or was done then lost by Yang Chenshan, but Yue Hanjian redid it, was basically writing a commentary on all the points of the 12 primary channels. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment as well. He also wrote about the points of the Ren and Du vessels, as well as essays on the other 6 extraordinary channels or vessels, sorry. Okay. So I thought I would show you guys also just a little bit about the text that I worked with when I was translating. Okay. So when I was working with the text, that is what I was looking at. Okay. I essentially had to go through and type up that text. I didn't have a copy of it. I would have to go through and I would have to write that up. It's read vertically and it's read, what's the opposite, right to left, and I basically, so before I could even start translating, I had to write it out and edit the text myself. Okay. Which, the text is not small, it's very big. So even before I could start translating, I had to work on the text. And that was, quite a lot to do in itself as well, because also, sometimes there would be on some notes. If you can see in the far right side, there's like some notes there. I might be able to draw on the screen. If we see here, like for example, over here, they have some notes and commentaries on the text as well, same as here, so then we kind of like, you need to look at that. So there were some variations in characters as well, which we footnoted, or if we decided it was important enough to as well. So even before you start translating, there's an extraordinary amount of work that you need to do to make sure that the text is correct and you're not translating incorrect things. Okay, there we go. So I just thought that would be interesting for people to kind of see what I was working with. So one of the other really important things is that when the commentaries on the points, he categorizes the diseases. Okay, now this is, I think, a really important aspect of the book because it allows us to kind of remember things a bit easier if we understand it and categorize it as well. I'll show you guys an example of how he does this later, but right now I want to just explain how he does it. What is his thinking of it, okay? So his categorization of disease is based off of Nanjing, or the classic of difficulties, or difficulties of the classics, difficulty 49 and 50, okay? And so how does this work? I'm going to talk about these in a moment, but I'll just give you guys an example. For examples of categorization of the 5 Zang-viscera diseases for a lung point. So if this point was on a lung channel, this is how he would categorize it. He would say, for example, diseases that relate to the lung, he would say lung disease of the lung. For diseases of the heart that a lung point treats, he would say heart disease of the lung. For a spleen disease that a lung point treats, he would say spleen disease of the lung. So the schematic, or how he applies this, is X disease of the Y. What does that mean? X is any of the 5 Zang. So, you know, the liver, heart, spleen, lung, kidney. And then the Y is the Zang-viscera, which the point is located on. So if it's the lung channel, then Y is the lung. If it's the heart channel, then Y is the heart. So that is how he categorizes it, okay? So what is this kind of idea of Nanjing 49 and 50? Okay, it presents us this idea called the 5 evils. But now you guys might even be a little bit skeptical and be saying, well, how does this idea come into acupuncture? Is there actually proof that people were using it? And so what I did was, and I think that's a fair question to ask. So what I've done is, first off, if you guys remember our opening quote from the book, Answers and Questions of Acupuncture and Moxibustion, which was written in 1530. So that's predating explanations of channels and points. We see in there, 16th question, it says, some people say the classic states diseases have a vacuity evil, an excess evil, a corrupt evil, a mild evil, and a self evil. What is the meaning of these? So it says, the classic states, when it comes from behind, it is a vacuity evil. When it comes from in front, it is a replete evil. When it comes from the place which it does not prevail over, it is a corrupt evil. And when it comes from the place which it prevails over, it is a mild evil, okay? Now, that is obviously very confusing. So I'm going to show you guys an example. Oh, and finally, when it itself is diseased, it is a self or principal evil, you could say. So what does this mean? Okay, so this important thing is to understand, don't get fixated on the disease that it is talking about, but rather think about the principle that this is trying to outline when it's talking about diseases. Because the diseases, or rather that they list here, don't really make that much sense, okay? So for example, it says, if the heart disease originated by wind, that is a vacuous evil, as wood is located behind fire and wood engenders fire has the mother. So that means that wood is coming from behind to basically attack fire. Essentially, there's not enough wood generating, so wood is vacuous. When drink and food or taxation fatigue that causes disease, this is an excess evil, as earth is located in front of fire and earth is the child. So earth is then, if you think about the 5 phases, is in front and is coming back to insult fire, okay? Now, when dampness that causes disease, this is a corrupt evil, okay, or corrupting evil, as water prevails over fire, okay? So once again, water and dampness, that doesn't make too much sense. We would probably think of more earth. So don't worry about dampness. Just think about more about how this idea works of water prevailing over fire in the 5 phases, okay? And once again, damage by cold relating to metal, that doesn't fit so well. But we see it, damage by cold that causes disease. This is a mild evil as fire prevails over metal, right? That makes sense. Fire controls metal, you know. Why is water a corrupting evil? Because water controls fire. And if water is causing a disease and fire, then it's very difficult to kind of, boost the fire because water naturally controls fire. Finally, damage by summer heat that causes disease. This is a self-evil, as fire itself is diseased. And then, fire would only be diseased. So when we think about these diseases, for example, a heart disease of the lung, then that is kind of, a corrupting evil because fire controls the lung and the lung is diseased, right? It's not a mild evil if we're looking at it from a lung perspective, because it is a mild evil if the lung is insulting fire, but if fire insults the lung, then that is quite, like a dangerous disease. Now, once again, even I'll show you further proof that this idea is used in acupuncture texts, because we see from the Gentle Da Chang or the complete compendium acupuncture and moxibustion, they actually even give us a chart. Okay, so what we see here, we see that we have sorry, let me do this. We have wood here that comes from behind, and that is a vacuity evil. We have earth that comes from in front, and that is a replete evil. We have metal, okay, and in this instance, it is that which doesn't prevail over it, so fire prevails over it, and it's a slight evil, okay. We have water, and water is that which prevails over fire, and then that is a corrupting evil, okay. So this, and then we have fire in the middle, which is a 正邪, or basically a self-evil. So here we basically have pictographic proof that people that acupuncturists were thinking about and using this schematic for diseases. Now, we have some examples. Sorry, let me clear this. Cool. Moving forward. So we have examples. So for examples of the disease categorization of heart 7, heart diseases of the heart, we would say heart pain with frequent belching, red face with a tendency to laugh, heat in the palms with dry retching, manic sorrow, manic laughing. So that's a heart disease of the heart, or basically a heart evil or self-evil. Spleen diseases of the heart, malaria, vexation of the heart, extreme desire for cold drinks, aversion to cold with a desire for a warm place, dry throat with no pleasure in eating, retching and vomiting of blood. So that would be a replete evil. But these are all diseases that heart 7 treats. We have lung diseases of the heart. So that would be like a mild evil. We have panting counterflow with generalized heat, shivering with cold and chia scent, urinary incontinence with loss of voice. And finally, we have liver disease, which would be a vacuous evil, liver diseases of the heart, yelling of the eyes with ribside pain, the 5 epilepsies of children and adults. So what you guys see here is that the diseases that they list in the 5 evils don't matter that much. What is important is really the kind of the principles behind it as well, and understanding that classification of diseases. Now, that's all well and good for the 5 Zang, but how does he approach the 6 Fu bowel channels? So the 6 Fu channels, how does he classify disease for them? Because the 5 evil model, that's a model for the 5 Zang. It doesn't actually apply, or 5 Zang and 5 elements, it doesn't actually apply to the 6 Fu. So he has his own style of writing this. He has principal diseases, okay? And now, what are the principal diseases? Well, these diseases are basically, from what I can gather, diseases that relate to primarily the flow of where the channel goes, okay? Not always, but generally. He'll also list diseases that relate to other Fu bowels or Zang-viscera. So, for example, if it's a large intestine point, he may list stomach diseases. And he may list, maybe lung diseases as well. So it lets us know that it treats some other diseases as well. Now, he also has some 8 extraordinary vessel diseases as well. That's quite rare as well. I should have actually put it under other diseases as well, because these ones are quite rare. He may split the channel into also the Fu and the Bao. So Principal diseases also often include maybe like large intestine diseases if it's related to the large intestine, but sometimes he might split that as well. He sometimes includes exterior versus interior diseases. Sometimes he also wrote Taiyang principal channel diseases. He also wrote about women's diseases. He also sometimes writes about location-based diseases as well, maybe like ear and eye. These are very uncommon though, but I will show you guys an example in the next slide. So this is how points were kind of written about. So on the left side, we see Yue Han Zhen. He classifies and categorizes it for us. He has principal diseases of Xiangyang, which is large intestine 1, and then he has, ear and eye diseases. He has lung diseases versus the uncategorized diseases. If you try and think about the difficulty in learning these, I think every person would take the one that is being categorized into diseases, because it is so much easier to understand and to learn from, rather than looking at basically an uncategorized mess of diseases that doesn't really have any logical form to help you remember. So really, Yue Han Zhen really offered something unique about classifying and categorizing diseases that had never been done in acupuncture before. And what's interesting is that I actually see a guy, Yang Jia San, who we mentioned earlier, who wrote the textbooks. He then does that later in his textbook, but he does it more by modern diseases as well, which I think is really cool. But we see someone that did it, almost 200 years earlier in the 17th century. All right. So I might have to rush this up a little bit. I apologize. I might go over maybe 5 minutes as well. So I do apologize for that. Study of acupuncture. So, when we think about how do we learn acupuncture, because I think maybe many of us have gone through and studied acupuncture. Some of us might have had a really good experience. Some of us maybe haven't had the best experience. But how did we learn it? How do we learn acupuncture? Okay. So teachers are generally our primary source at schools, okay? Look, and I think teachers, we probably have some good teachers, we probably have some bad teachers. But unfortunately, I think a lot of teachers in the West, they have a tough time of expanding information because they don't read Chinese. So it comes back to this idea of how do we go back to the source of the information? Well, if you don't read Chinese, it's very, very difficult. And we do have good literature in the West. We have some very bad literature. I'll talk about that later. But they do the best that they can with what they have. And I think that generally teachers do want to do the best that they can with the information that they have available. Okay. So the next thing that we have is we have books. Now, literature in Chinese medicine in English can be very, I would say, dangerous. There are some very, very, very good books, and there are also some very, very bad books. Okay. How do we judge a good book in Chinese medicine? In my opinion, the first thing that you should do for any book is open up and you should go to a bibliography. I'm just trying to, or, this one actually has, I think the text, I'll show you. I know that one has the text consulted at the front. But for this book, for example, you can go through and you can see kind of like a bibliography, okay? And it's a bit hard to see, but, there's a lot of Chinese literature in there. So when you're looking up a Chinese medical book, always go, or even an article, always go and see what are their sources. And if their sources don't list Chinese books, whether translated or not, preferably untranslated, but if they're not translated, if they are translated, then hopefully they're using quality translations. If they don't list Chinese literature, the question you should be asking yourself is, where do they get this information from? How, in traditional Chinese medicine, tradition is a large part. We have a tradition, and generally it's a literary tradition. We had the Neijing. That's where a lot of our principles come from. And then these books come through and build on it. So if we want to be practicing traditional Chinese medicine, we should be referencing these traditional texts. So if you have a book and it's lacking any kind of traditional reference, it doesn't mean that it's not good, but I would be kind of very skeptical of the information. And I can tell you this, if someone gives you a scientific paper and it has no references, are you going to believe that paper? I mean, how can, if you submitted any paper to a journal with no references, it would be crazy that they wouldn't have references to it. Papers have to have references, but for some reason, a lot of Chinese medical books don't have references in them. Okay. And so those books, be very skeptical of them. Experience, this is kind of our own experience, our teachers' experiences, and also our case studies experiences as well. These things are all really important. Hey, can you guys stop the drawing on the screen, please? Just the one of the mods, just stop people from drawing on the screen. Thank you. And so we have our teachers, and we also have case studies as well. But unfortunately, case studies are not often taught in schools either as well. And so that's kind of one of the things that I'm really going to be trying to bring in this course. So once again, how are we taught acupuncture in schools? Basically in modern schools, we get taught acupuncture point. And what do we get taught? The location. We get taught functions. Okay. We get taught indications, maybe some, not all of them. Okay. And, if there's anything else, then let me know. But I think that's generally how acupuncture points are taught. There's not that much information about them. Okay. Now, in the past, we would also have location, but we would have indications. We wouldn't have functions, because functions were created basically in the 70s and 80s. And but the functions are derived from the indications. This is why I think we've got to go back and study indications. Indications are important. We would also study odes and songs as well. We would probably have a teacher's experience, and we would probably also utilize the classics as well, as much as possible. Okay. Now, how will we be approaching the study of acupuncture points in my course? Okay. So, analysis of a point. First off, we will look at the name of the point. We will look at the characters of the point, and we will discuss them as well. We will discuss why this point is called what it is. And I will not just be drawing on my book, I will also be drawing on other interpretations of the name and analysis of the characters as well. We'll be looking at the location of the point as well, and whether or not there are also any, disagreements in the location as well, or any kind of inaccuracies of transmission as well. But what I'm going to be doing is be giving you guys essentially the traditional location of the point, because I'm definitely not a believer that our modern accurate location of the points, where you have to get it down to the finest millimeter, that's not how they practice acupuncture in the past. We say point, but it is almost kind of like a little bit more of an area, I think. It's not just this fine tip of the needle, it's more of a little bit of an area as well. So I think there's definitely a little bit of flexibility with a point as well, that you don't, it's not like a little pinprick. We'll talk about category as well, if this is needed. If there's, whether it belongs to what I call the front collecting or alarm points, Jing River, so forth, or any other kind of categorization as well. We'll talk about diseases as well. So we'll start off looking at probably functions, looking at how they've got these functions from two of the most famous authors, Yang Jia-san and Dang Kuai-shan as well, looking at their functions as well. And then we're going to really go through and break down the indications for each point, discussing why these points do what they do. And we're going to look at classical indications, but then we're also going to look at some modern indications as well, because we need to face the reality that we treat patients in a modern clinical reality who have modern diseases as well. So it's kind of, when people come in with a modern disease, we might think, oh yeah, I know this, I remember this point. Let's do that, and we'll treat that, and we can always go back and research more points to use later on as well. Now, the next part we're going to do is do ancestral knowledge. So that means we're going to be looking at some songs or odes that relate to the point. These are basically maybe other indications from a song, but also maybe combinations of a point as well. So we can understand perhaps how we can use these points more effectively as well. Because I actually haven't, there is, I think, one Blue Poppy book that talks a little bit about, that's out of print, that talks about acupuncture combinations. But we see some acupuncture combination books, but from what I can tell is that they don't really quote the classics. They're not really mentioning any kind of classical texts as well. They're more just discussions as well. Now, the final, what I would say is actually one of the most important aspects that I want to deliver to you guys is supplementary wisdom from Lao Zhongyi, or kind of, you know, these famous acupuncturist authors. But also what I think is the most important part in probably studying an acupuncture point is case studies. Okay. And this is almost never taught in any schools, as far as I can tell. It's case studies from famous physicians, because that will tell us how these people utilize this point to treat diseases. And then that way, you know, if someone comes into your clinic, you can think, oh yeah, I remember this case study that this famous doctor used to treat this disease. Let's give that a shot. Because then, you know, you're really bringing in kind of this idea of like also the lineage of Chinese medicine as well. You're continuing on this process. And I think that is a really important part. So when we look at an acupuncture point, we're really going to look at it, I think, more in depth than any other course is offering it as well. And you know, so if you guys have any questions about that, you can write them in the chat. So talking about the outline of the course. So each class will be about 3 hours. We start about 1 month from now. We start off with the lung. Week 2 is the spleen. Week 3 is the heart. Week 4 is kidneys. Week 5 is the liver. And week 6 is the pericardium, you know, / kind of tight conclusion, and also any Q&A as well. Okay, so we do it for 6 weeks. It's basically the last Sunday. It's the Sunday for me, Sunday night. If you guys are in Europe, or depending where you are, it might be, I think it's a morning for you guys if you're in Europe. So yeah, we'll have some fun on a Sunday. I think that'll be a lot of fun as well. So, you know, I really think if you guys want to try and study, you know, acupuncture and points, get an understanding of the classics, the language used, that this is a really unique and rare opportunity to learn it. So that concludes my talk today. If you guys look in the chat, then they have posted up some information as well. From what I recall is that there is still an early bird special to register for the course until February 6th. And you get 10% off the course as well. So that, you know, that saves you, I think, 35 euros. You know, that's not chump change. That's a pretty good savings, if you ask me as well. So I will now open up and just say, do we have any questions? I believe that you guys can write them in the chat box as well. I think that someone asked whether or not we'll have the slides. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint. I also believe that the PowerPoint will be uploaded to YouTube as well as the Global Branches website as well. So if I spoke quickly, I apologize. There was just a bit of content to cover. But you guys can go back and watch it. And just like if you guys do the class, if you miss a class, you'll be able to access the video online. So you don't have to worry if it's not in a great time zone for you, you can still access it. Okay. Are there any questions or anything like that?
Well,
Otherwise,
if there is someone there, they can unmute themselves and just ask. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
On behalf of Global Branches, I would like to thank you. It was an amazing class and very, very clarifying. I can feel this is an amazing opportunity to bring this heritage from this old knowledge and bringing to the Western crowds. And having you as a teacher, I can feel it's an amazing opportunity. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everyone who came and Global Branches as well. You know, maybe someone is writing a question for a moment. We might just give them a minute or two. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. This was more just to give you guys like a little bit of an introduction to my processes of thinking, how I approach the medicine, and ultimately how we'll do the course as well. I think it'll be a really cool and fun thing to do. And like I said, my main goal is, I want to give you guys a lot of information that I've found useful, that I've read, that isn't translated into English as well. Yeah, so and basically, what I've tried to do is I've tried to analyze how things have been presented in the past, and perhaps how we can improve upon schools and how they've taught us as well. And I think if you guys do the course, we'll have a lot of fun. There'll be a lot of unique information there as well. And like I said, I'm not just going to be lecturing from my book. There'll be a bit of information from there, but there'll be a lot of other information that I'm going to be incorporating into it as well. Now, thank you, Xian. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Karina and Liv and Vanessa, Peter, Andrea, Felix, and everyone else who's said thank you for coming through as well. Yeah, it's I really appreciate all of you guys coming in and joining me. It's I really hope you enjoyed it. And so I think, like, no questions. If anyone has a question, then ask it now. Otherwise, if you guys have other questions about the course, then please contact anyone at Global Branches. Or if you perhaps have something related specifically to the content and you want to ask me, then you're welcome to email me, or you can send me a message on Facebook. I'm quite approachable. Just, I do have a newborn child, so perhaps if don't expect the response straight away. He's 1.5 months old, so I do my best, but I'm still a little bit busy. Oh, Sarah, you're muted.
Thank you so much. It was an amazing class once more, and hope to see all of you next month on February 27 for your course. See you then. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
See you guys.
Soon.